All right, we're back with IT Coach for Business Leaders. This is episode 7. I'm Josh Davis, Director of Marketing with InfoSystems, and with me as always, Aaron Swann, Virtual CIO for InfoSystems, and all things IT guru.
I don't know about all things.
How's it going, Aaron?
Doing well, how about you?
Doing good, thanks. So we're kind of in the middle of entering a renovation phase here at
Yes.
InfoSystems. We're going to update our office after many years of living in it as is. Not that there's anything wrong with it as is, but I think they just wanted to update the workspace to make it a little more collaborative. And there's all these initiatives out to make workspace to where people can see and approach, and it's more open and inviting and less cubed and walled and so forth. So as part of that process, they're going to redo our conference room. So these next couple of episodes that we're recording will probably be the last that will look like this. And so the challenge moving forward will be, what is our new look going to be for our podcast set?
Probably needs to be in some exotic location, I think.
I mean,
We need a travel budget.
could we go to Bahamas and do a remote shoot from there and on the beach, IT discussion on the beach?
There we go.
Okay.
Well,
Stuff to keep in mind.
Silicone, right? So
Yeah,
it's relevant.
that's right. Okay, so today we're talking, I think today's topic is a great topic. We've obviously discussed what we're going to be talking about and planned out the main points that we want to bring up. But I thought it was interesting that we just finished a series that was the 3 main challenges for
Right.
small business with IT. And then we get to today's topic, which is backups. And really that could be, just like any other number of other issues, that could be one of the top 3 challenges.
Yeah, it absolutely. Or number 4, or maybe even number 1.
Right.
I'll tell you, I do a lot of, when we mentioned this before, we'll go into a lot of businesses and do a site assessment, and typically after I do those, I'll do a write-up back to the salesperson that's working with me on the account, and I'll typically list out things I've seen. I may categorize them, critical, important, optional, or things to put on the roadmap for down the road. And it's scary how often that backup ends up in that critical category, because I found oftentimes a severe deficiency in what they have backup wise, and many times they don't even realize that.
Right. Yeah, and depending on what business you walk into, they've got any set of IT systems in place and very unique business processes and needs. And so, I'm assuming that list that you give back to them could include any number of things. And so to say that there are a top 3 or any set number of challenges for small businesses is kind of arbitrary.
Yes.
But before we talk about backups, I thought it would be a good idea to kind of establish the importance of this topic.
Sure.
And you mentioned, while we were talking through the plans for these episodes, you mentioned some statistics that you've given in presentations and meetings over the years that you got from the Small Business Administration, the SBA. Can you run through some of that information just sort of to establish the importance of this?
Well, I think the number one statistic there, so on their website, sba.gov, they quote the Institute for Business and Home Safety, saying that about 25%, an estimate, of businesses that have some type of an IT disaster, a major disaster, just never reopen. It's a business killer. That's a pretty alarming statistic and a pretty high number. About a quarter of them never come back from that.
Yeah.
Some other things they talk about is, all businesses in some form are going to lose data of some sort, and there's multiple ways. Natural disasters make up about 3% of that. Hardware failure, big one, about 44% of the time they lose data because of hardware failure.
Mhm.
Malware accounts for about 7%, human error about 32%, and then software corruption about 14%. So there's lots of different ways, lots of different enemies out there of your data. The thing about backup, though, a properly, and emphasize on the word properly, configured backup system can recover from 100% of those things that I just mentioned
Hmm.
if you do it right.
Yeah. Keyword.
Yeah.
Do it right.
Right.
So, obviously, if 25% of businesses can't even recover from a major IT disaster,
Right.
and I'm assuming data loss is probably the main component of that. Yeah, that's pretty alarming. But okay, so kind of diving into the main topic. Often, backups are part of an overall IT strategy of disaster recovery,
Right.
or we often in the IT industry call it DR for short. Can you kind of give a basic explanation of what disaster recovery is, how backups are a part of that, and also maybe just how backup should really just be a standalone
Sure.
topic itself?
Yeah, so disaster recovery is a far more encompassing topic. It gets into more than just how do I get my data back. So it's going to incorporate things in there, even outside the IT world, right? So, if one of your disasters, for example, is a fire, your building has burned down or, been so contaminated by smoke that you can't work in there. One of the things about DR is, well, where are you going to work in the meantime? When you get your data back, but where are employees going to come to? Are they going to work from home? Are you going to rent some space? There's other things that play into that. Insurance policies certainly play into disaster recovery, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, it's making sure that you've got the proper insurances to cover your goods if they come back. I think one of the reasons why backup should maybe, as you mentioned, even be a standalone topic is because it is something you can do. Yes, you, the business, need to look at an all-encompassing DR plan, but I would say don't let, that takes some time and energy to put that together.
Right.
Don't let that be an obstacle to go ahead and getting that backup taken care of, because that's a vital portion, especially from an IT perspective. And backup is going to be able to do things, mitigate against things that all the insurance coverage in the world can't, right? So, you can put an insurance policy on tangible items, including your servers, your data center, your, tables and chairs and lamps, all those things, and you can get new ones.
Right.
Insurance coverage really can't cover you too much from getting your data back.
Yeah.
Maybe you can be compensated for that loss in some ways, but that data, if it's gone, it's gone. So that's, I would hit backup as a standalone thing, get that taken care of, and then fold that into a more encompassing plan.
So when you're consulting in a VCIO role with small businesses around our area, I know you're always a proponent of executive leadership,
Right.
company leadership being involved in pretty much most of the IT topics. I'm sure there are some that don't require executive perspective, but backups and DR absolutely one that does in your, from what you've told me in the past. So what is it about backups? Why should company leadership be involved in that discussion?
Well, it's a similar thing. We talked back in, I think it was episode 3 of our small business challenge thing, that under the topic of security, it's important for a business to take an inventory of all their assets, what they've got going on. And I think we made the comment there, no business out there has unlimited sacks of cash sitting around to be able to provide security protection. The same thing goes into disaster recovery and backup. Executive leadership needs to be involved in making those decisions about prioritizing the budget and the spend for how you're going to protect those assets, because different assets may need different levels of protection, and IT can't always make that call on what's vital to the business. You know, I've got different customers, and depending on the business that they're in, the system that they run, you know, for some, email may be the number one thing. We cannot lose email. Other companies is like, well, you know, email is a communication tool we use, but, you know, my customer database, that's the most important thing.
Yeah.
And so it's making sure that executive leadership is involved in helping make those decisions, you know, primarily about budget.
So thinking about, you know, customer database being so important, what about the days when Rolodex was the standard?
Yeah.
I mean, no backups there.
No. So
At least we're in a better place with technology
we've
than
come
we
a
used to
long
be.
way on that.
So I mean, I find it interesting, you know, the perspective that a company leader can add on topics like backups, you know, because they're going to look at the business and, like you say, place a different value on various aspects of the business, whether it's assets, whether it's the data that the business owns, or the business systems and processes. I mean, to me, that's just a fascinating topic. Do you have any perspective from, you know, time that you've spent with customers on differing opinions between IT and executive leadership about, you know, is backup important? Like, I guess what I'm trying to get at is, have there been times you've seen where IT is saying, yes, we really need this, business leadership is saying, no, we really don't, or vice versa?
Yeah, and it's usually the first example that you mentioned, and it's because IT people know that systems are fallible. they're going to fail at some point. Executives don't always. I think that's getting more true, that they do get it in today's age.
Yeah.
You know, it's on the news enough now that people, you know, have started to clue into that. But historically, that's not been the case. It's been, you know, backup is seen as just another money hole, right? This is something I just got to throw money at. I don't really get any benefit back out of that. And so, you know, there's been, and we've seen that, you know, when we go to customers, and, you know, particularly a new customer where we're going in and quoting them a whole brand new system and everything, you know, it's shocking how often, you know, someone would go through there and it's like, well, do we really need this system? Because that adds a lot of zeros to the proposal. And, you know, I've come to the point, it's like, yeah, you really do, because these things are going to fail at some point. It might be, you know, it could be a manufacturing defect, and they might fail next week. It might be 5 years from now, but if you don't have that in place to protect you, there's going to be data loss.
Yeah, I guess there's, you know, from the statistics that you cited that said a very high percentage of data loss comes from hardware failure.
Right, almost half.
I mean, that's another area of expense that executives are looking at, and it's not like you just want to replace your infrastructure every 2 to 3 years because you always want to make sure that there's no hardware failure. I mean,
Right.
the mindset is usually, let's run this as long as it possibly makes sense to maximize our investment before we upgrade.
And you get more and more vulnerable the longer that goes on.
Right. So, you know, I guess those two play hand in hand, especially when you're, you know, making decisions on where to invest, how much to invest, and what are the most important systems to protect and to upgrade. And,
Right.
So I want to bring up a couple of IT terms that are parts of the discussion you usually have with executives and the IT department when they're choosing a solution for backups. And that's RTO and RPO. Can you explain what RTO and RPO are?
Absolutely, and that's something, and that's probably the key data points that executive leadership needs to wrap their heads around and make a decision about to help IT make decisions. So RTO stands for Recovery Time Objective. RPO stands for Recovery Point Objective. So the best way I know to do this, what I typically do when I'm sitting down with a company is just, we draw a line, like a timeline.
Mm-hmm.
And you look along that line and the point on that line when your disaster happens or when your hardware failure, when your data loss occurs, right?
Mm-hmm.
So anywhere on there, I'm going along, everything's good. Right here on this Wednesday, data loss occurred. Our PO, so recovery point objective, works backwards from that time, and that is how far back do I have to go to get valid data that I can recover from. Another way of saying it is how much data am I going to lose? Because typically backups aren't something that runs 24/7. It's not an instantaneous thing,
Right.
although it can be.
Yeah.
So RPO says, how much am I going to have to recreate? RTO goes the opposite way on the timeline, and that is from the moment that data loss occurs, how much time is it going to take before I'm back in business, I have my data again. So the ideal answer to both of those in a perfect world would be 0, right? I don't want to lose any data,
Yeah.
and I don't ever want to be down. I just want it to come back up instantly. I want to be able to instant recovery. That's pretty much possible now. You can get to 0 for both of those, or very close to it.
Mm-hmm.
But as you might imagine, like anything in IT, the closer you get to 0, the more money you have to spend to get to that.
Right.
So most businesses don't have a 0 time frame in mind. A more typical thing we have found, a recovery point objective is, well, I can lose a day's worth of data, right? So if my backups run at night, I do those every night. If I have a disaster, that night or the next day, I can always go back 24 hours to my last backup. The majority of businesses that we work with, that's an acceptable solution.
Mm-hmm.
I will say that RPO, with today's technology, it's got a whole lot easier to get closer to 0 without having to put out lots and lots of money to do so.
Mm-hmm.
RTO is a little more difficult. So if we're talking about recovery time objective, how quickly can I be back up? Well, from a just purely restoring the backup perspective, pretty quick, probably, but there's more to it than that, right?
Yeah.
If I've had a hardware failure, I've got my backup, I can recover from that. Well, I've got to recover to something, right? So if I've had a hardware failure, I'm going to have to get another server. If my building's burned down,
Yeah.
I've got more problems that I've got to deal with. So there's other things besides just the backup itself that plays into that, getting that RTO where you want it to be.
Yeah.
Which could be, redundancy. It could be hot sites that you've got to set up somewhere else. It could be cloud services that allow you to run your whole system in the cloud, or maybe even a portion of it.
Mm-hmm.
Again, and the thing to keep in mind for RPO and RTO is it doesn't have to apply for your entire system equally.
Right.
In fact, doing so might be very, very expensive.
Yeah.
If the goal is to have everything I own, 0 data loss and backup tomorrow, that's probably going to be pretty expensive. But if there's one key system that you want to focus on, it might be possible to where I can get that one system back up for you almost instantaneously.
Mm-hmm.
So it's executive leadership has got to make those decisions as, what impacts my business the most, and what's the best way for me to spend my money to get the best bang for my buck.
Yep. Yeah, those are great points. And I know in a future episode, we're going to talk more about the actual technology that's in place
Right.
to make those different, recovery times possible and recovery points possible. But for this discussion, just kind of laying the foundation of why is backup important, what is a backup strategy, how does it fit into disaster recovery overall. I think it's really important to lay this foundation, and like you say, make sure that in a company when they're looking at IT solutions to put in place, that there is true engagement across the board with,
Right.
if they have internal IT resources or if they have an IT partner, that they are collaborating with company leadership to identify and make those decisions to implement the best solution for their particular situation. Can you, just quickly, I know this is not a platform for InfoSystems to self-promote. Our focus is to educate.
Right.
But part of that education, in my opinion, is helping business leaders understand who is out there to help with these types of situations. So in your role as VCIO, how would you work with a company to assess their current IT infrastructure and decide on a backup strategy?
Sure. Well, so I think it starts with a site assessment. Let's look at what you have, what systems you have, talk with executive leadership and say, okay, let's play pretend. Tomorrow, your systems have gone down. What are you going to be on the phone screaming about be the most that you want back up first?
Yeah.
What's your priority? And let's walk through that. Well, we got that back up. Now what? And just, make that prioritized list of what have you got to get back up and going first. I think another thing is, when we talk about the recovery point objective, yes, we're looking for 0 on that. But there's other forms of data loss besides a hardware failure. We mentioned software corruption, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Software system can get corrupt and cause a database that you have been using, and one day you go into that database and you see, wow, those numbers aren't right. Something's happened along the way here. I need to go back and get a historical copy of that database. Well, that brings another statistic into play, and that's retention period.
Okay.
One of the things, and we'll talk about it in later episodes about pros and cons of various backup types, but another decision executive leadership needs to make is, what kind of retention periods do I need? In other words, is it good enough to say, if you can get me back to like I was yesterday, is that good enough? I'm going to say probably not,
Yeah.
because there's lots of other things that can come into play. So, retention periods is like, could I go back and get a version of a document or a database or some other form of data that's 6 weeks old? Or how about 6 months old? Or, in some cases, some of the businesses we work with have compliance regulations on them. And they may need to have the ability to go back and get something that's up in the years. Most compliance tops out at about 7 years,
Mm-hmm.
but they might have the need to go back and get something from 5 years ago. Do your retention periods give you the ability to do that, just from things are operating normally, or wow, we had a disaster, I still need to get that data back from 3 years ago.
Yeah.
So that's another decision that's got to be made, and IT's not equipped to make that decision, right? That's
Mm-hmm.
leadership's got to decide. We fall under HIPAA compliance, for example, if you're a medical practice, and our policies tell us that we have to be able to go back and get that patient record from 4 years ago.
So is that the same thing, is retention period that you're talking about, is that the same thing as data archiving?
Data archiving can play into retention, but archiving and backup, though similar in a lot of ways, are not the same thing. Let's use email as an example. I think that's the one most people are familiar with. If I go into my email, I open up my Outlook and I see those thousands of messages there. I try to be a good boy and keep that cleaned up as much as I can. But we all know emails constantly coming in.
Yeah.
You can move some of your email off into an archive folder, which is going to make your regular Outlook snappier, right? It's going to it's going to move a little faster if I can move some of that archive, and it'll make it easier for me to sort through things as well, if I'm not having to look at just thousands of messages, get it down to hundreds of messages perhaps. So archiving is subtly different in that it's a different copy, it's an older version of the data, but it's probably still stored just on mainline storage.
Right.
So it doesn't give me protection against data loss. It's more of an organizational tool than anything.
Gotcha.
Glad you brought that up, though. I mean, there's lots of confusion, I think, sometimes between archiving. Another one, I think, is replication. Just the idea that I'm going to replicate my data, make copies of it for availability purposes. Let's imagine that you've got a multi-site business that exists, several sites around town or maybe across the country, and you're replicating that data for speed and accessibility purposes. I've got a copy here in Chattanooga, I may have a copy in Texas, may have one out in Oklahoma, or up in Cleveland, Tennessee, and all those sites have the same copy of the data. Does that give me some protection? Well, yeah. It does protect me against that if Chattanooga, a hurricane rips through here, probably not, a tornado rips through here and blows my building apart, then that copy of the data resides down in Texas, which is immune to hurricanes, right? Let's go Oklahoma maybe. So I've got some protection there. What it doesn't protect me against, though, is human error. So let's say, one of my employees goes in and is like, oh, I don't need that copy of that file, or they're just kind of a little careless and they wipe out a directory and delete it. Well, with replication, what's going to happen? It's going to replicate that deletion to my other sites as well. So I haven't really protected myself. Or a worse scenario is if I'm hacked in some way. This real life story about this, we have a company we've done business with that fired one of their IT people and did not put adequate protection in place when they left. And that person got back in, hacked into their systems, and wiped out one of the replication stores here in Chattanooga, and it replicated to the other sites and wiped it all out. They weren't backing that up because they felt like they didn't need to because it was replicated everywhere. So that was a major data loss for them. So a true backup is going to be something that's offline, and when I say offline, it's something users can't access. It's a copy that's taken, but it's moved off to a safe place that only my administration has access to.
Which could be a physical place, maybe an off-site tape backup that was taken away, or it could be a cloud that people just don't have access to. I mean, there's different things. So, but that's something we'll talk through in the next episode when we get into more of the technology discussion. But I think this was a great topic today, and I think knowing the importance of protecting your data, protecting your IT system so that you can continue business if something bad happens. I mean, obviously that should be top of mind for company executives. And I mean, honestly, when my perspective is, if some type of disaster happened, the employees are not going to look to the IT department to say, you should have protected us from this. They're going to be looking at the company leadership and saying, why were we not prepared for something like this? So definitely something that company executives should be engaged in to make sure that they're caring for their business the way it should be. But okay, well, I think that pretty much wraps up this discussion. This may have been a shorter episode. That's not necessarily a bad thing.
No, it's not.
But on to the next one when we'll talk more about backup technologies.
All right.
Thanks, Aaron.
Thank you.